Are we on? Good morning. Good morning to everyone in Brussels and other parts of Europe, and good afternoon to all of you who are listening from far away, maybe in Southeast Asia, because today we have a topic which is of very high interest in the region. Welcome to the European Institute for Asian Studies and to this event online to exchange on the future of Myanmar, 9 months after the coup d'etat of 1st February 2021, which ended a short-lived experiment with democratic rule. I am Xavier Nutin, Senior Associate of the European Institute for Asian Studies, and I will have the pleasure to chair this exchange of views with guests speaking from Thailand and Singapore. Everybody will remember that, well, not everybody, but some of you will remember that on the 11th of May, we organized already an event on the future of Myanmar. That was exactly 100 days after the coup d'etat. ASEAN had just decided to appoint a special envoy to start a dialogue with all stakeholders. During that event, we took stock of the political situation, and our guest speakers exchanged on how the international community could contribute to a peaceful solution to the current problems. Today, 9 months after the coup, has anything changed in the country? Apparently not. The country remains in total chaos. More than 1,000 people were killed by the Tatmadaw, the Burmese army. The economy is collapsing. The World Food Programme warns of a humanitarian crisis, and the sanitary situation is going from bad to worse as the COVID-19 pandemic is not being addressed properly. It seems that the military are once again destroying the country and its population for the sake of their own interest and power. Last week, ASEAN took the bold and encouraging decision not to invite Senior General Min Aung Hlaing at the Leaders' Summit that took place on the 26th of October. They requested a non-political representative from Myanmar. As a result, the Myanmar seat remained empty, something extraordinary in the context of ASEAN, which is built on the idea of consensus, on the principles of consensus and non-interference. We will see with one of our speakers today what can be learned from that meeting and what to expect in the coming months. So far, the generals have not given any signs that they are prepared to back down, despite the fact that through the civic disobedience movement, ordinary citizens, public servants, and some diplomats have made clear that they will not accept the situation. In addition, the military showed no signs to bow to external pressure, be it from ASEAN, the EU, or the US. But today we will not only look at the high politics, how important it is, but also at the daily life of the citizens. We will try to analyze more in depth the economic consequences on the citizens of Myanmar of what can be called the three catastrophes: the military coup, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the economy ruined by 9 months of unrest. According to an April report by the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, this could plunge almost half of Myanmar population into poverty, reversing economic gains made over the last 16 years. We will also see if regional powers, through economic pressure, could have greater leverage and influence than the Western countries. China obviously has great influence in Myanmar, but we know that China's concern is about stability for economic development and not about democratic principles. Some private companies from Japan and South Korea have suspended their joint ventures with the military-controlled businesses. Some of them have even quit those joint ventures. And this could probably be used, they could probably use their economic leverage to a greater extent. It's also very well known that Singapore is the largest investor in Myanmar. And from the European side, many European companies are wondering whether to stay or to quit. To address those issues and many more, and also during your questions, excuse me, during your questions, during the Q&A session after the presentation, we have 3 distinguished speakers on our panel. We have Mrs. Mo Tuzar, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. Mo is the coordinator of the Myanmar Studies Program at the ISS, and as such, specialized in Myanmar foreign policy and Myanmar relations with ASEAN and major powers. She's a former diplomat, and she joined the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore in 2008, after 10 years at the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta. We also have Mrs. Claudine Henny, former Swiss and UN diplomat in Myanmar. She's the managing director of Bridging Changes, a company that focuses on leadership development, training, and negotiation. She previously worked for the Swiss government on humanitarian aid, peace support, human rights, and democratization, and was in NAPIDO from 2018 to 2020 to work with the UN Special Envoy on Myanmar. Our third speaker is Mr. Felix Haas, Managing Director from Progress Asia Consulting. Felix has served as an independent consultant to public and private sector clients in Asia since 2013, and his company works with businesses and government agencies to develop public-private cooperation and to contribute to socio-economic progress in the region. So without any further ado, I will give the floor first to Mo Tuzar to discuss the ASEAN-led approach, or to present to us the ASEAN-led approach under Brunei chairmanship, including the results of the last ASEAN Leaders Summit, and to review the economic and political interests of some of the ASEAN member states, in particular Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, and their influence on the current economic situation of the Myanmar citizen. Mo, the floor is yours for 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. Good afternoon from Singapore to everyone tuning in for this discussion. And I would like to thank EIAS for inviting me to share my views on this continuing topic of interest, which is what's happening in Myanmar following the February 1st military coup earlier this year. Now, my brief for this afternoon is really to look at the ASEAN-led approach for the Myanmar crisis and what has transpired up to now, and how that is probably being viewed from different perspectives on the ground in Myanmar. So I think all of us around this Zoom platform will be aware of what transpired last week at the 38th and 39th ASEAN summits under the chairmanship of Brunei Darussalam, which is the rotational ASEAN chair for this year, for 2021, as well as also the related summits that ASEAN convened with its dialogue partners. There are now 11, with the United Kingdom having come on board as an ASEAN dialogue partner earlier this year. So, of course, what was the attention? I guess the center of attention when people were following or monitoring the ASEAN summits was the empty screen for Myanmar. The State Administration Council had tried very hard the State Administration Council junta, the military junta that seized power on February the 1st, 2021, deposing the elected National League for Democracy government. They were trying very hard to assert their legitimacy of representation for Myanmar at both regional and international forums. And this has been, I think, the focus of a lot of its external relations, foreign policy projections. Now, ASEAN was one of the multilateral forums where the SAC regime could still highlight that it was participating and contributing to the discussions, because business as usual meetings among the different and various sectors of cooperation in ASEAN did continue with representatives, civil servants under the SAC regime sitting in the Myanmar seat. And it was not only at working level, there were also similar representation at senior officials level and even at ministerial level, including for some meetings with ASEAN's dialogue partners. But the fact that ASEAN foreign ministers convened an emergency meeting on the 15th of October, specifically to look at the situation of the implementation of ASEAN's 5-point consensus to respond to the emergencies in Myanmar, and to also discuss the representation of Myanmar at the summit was quite significant, because it was there that the foreign ministers of the ASEAN member states, of the 9 ASEAN member states, Myanmar being represented by the SAC appointed foreign minister objecting, agreed that the Myanmar representative at the ASEAN summit would be a non-political representative, interpreted as being of a senior civil servant rank, but not anyone who would be holding those kinds of key political officers in the executive, currently those positions of authority that the SAC regime is holding, and that would include the ministers appointed by the SAC regime as well. And so this was what caught the world's attention, I suppose. And the SAC tried to mount a legal challenge to ASEAN on its decision, but I think whatever legal challenge that it has tried to make just did not hold water. It does not hold water with the types of ASEAN Charter principle arguments that they were trying to make. So here, I think what's important to note is that ASEAN decisions and agreements, we like to look at them as being consensus-based, and also trying to uphold this principle that is not just in the ASEAN Charter, that is also in the charter of many other international and regional organizations about non-interference. But the fact that what we saw at the ASEAN summit really illustrates that ASEAN decisions and agreements may be the result of negotiated compromise, even if there are different views among the different states. But the agreements made, it reflects a broad agreement among the member states nevertheless, and that it has, of course, this agreement from the highest levels of government for such decisions to be made. And of course, we have to look at why ASEAN is also making this kind of statement, because if we look back at earlier this year in April, the ASEAN leaders actually convened a special meeting in Jakarta at the ASEAN Secretariat with the express purpose of impressing upon Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, the head of the SAC junta, of the importance of bringing about a cessation to the violence and a constructive outcome to the crisis that the February 1st coup had catalyzed. And the 5-point consensus that was reached at that meeting among the 9 heads of state or government of the ASEAN member states and Senior General Min Aung Hlaing was to have ASEAN coordinate that process, ASEAN implement that process of trying to assist work on Myanmar returning to normalcy. But what happened soon after was, of course, that the SAC very soon started backtracking on its agreement to that 5-point consensus, and also stonewalled the proposed visits of the ASEAN special envoy, the special envoy of the ASEAN chair, which was also one of the points of the ASEAN 5-point consensus. So taking all this into consideration, and with the very obvious lack of progress in the SAC working with Myanmar towards implementing the ASEAN 5-point consensus to which it had agreed, and of course now culminating in this disinvite to the highest level key political meeting of ASEAN. What is important in all of this is that this practice about engaging the country concerned whenever ASEAN needs to do a response with regard to maintaining and upholding regional stability and security, whenever ASEAN tries to intervene constructively into a country, a member state concerned, this practice about engaging that the concerned country to have that constructive intervention, I would say, looking at it from where I'm sitting, that this practice is undergoing significant changes with a view towards more accountability. So it's no longer something that is going to go on with the goodwill of ASEAN, but there are important accountability expectations and measures that ASEAN will be looking for and requesting and discussing with the people accountable in Myanmar. And at the ASEAN summits, of course, usually have summary statements issued by the chair of the summits. And this year's summit is no exception. The chairman's statement for the 38th and 39th ASEAN summits is 102 paragraphs long. But what I noticed at the very end of that last paragraph, the last 2 paragraphs were focused on the situation in Myanmar. So in the last sentence of that last paragraph of the chairman's statement, it mentioned that ASEAN remained committed to support Myanmar in its efforts to return to normalcy in accordance with the will of the people of Myanmar. And this, for me, we can interpret it as, this is really conveying the sentiments on the part of the 9 ASEAN member states that they are concerned about the will, the situation, the aspirations of the Myanmar people. And so, I think it is a rather diplomatic way of also reflecting that, where the hearts and sentiments of the ASEAN member states lie with regard to Myanmar. So this is something that is quite new. It has set a precedent in terms of what will happen for future high-level key political meetings. And I think coming up later in November will be the Asia-Europe meeting, ASEAN Summit, that Cambodia will be co-hosting and chairing, I understand, with Europe. And also coming up later in November is the ASEAN-China commemorative summit. So these would be where, I guess, the current precedent of disinviting the SAC regime will be also, I think, receiving attention and focus. Incidentally, under the rotational terms of duty for coordinating ASEAN's dialogue partner relations, each of the ASEAN member states are assigned a country coordinator responsibility on a rotational basis of 3 years to coordinate cooperation with dialogue partners also in rotation. So under that kind of rotation cycle, Myanmar is actually the country coordinator for ASEAN-China dialogue relations, and all that is now sort of up in the air with what has happened after February the 1st. Now, okay, what does all this mean, I think, on the ground? Because these are things that are happening at the high political table, but what is happening in Myanmar, if we look at this from the broader humanitarian context, if we look at it from the viewpoint of people in towns and cities and villages across Myanmar, particularly those right now in the areas where the military is focusing its vengeance and its disproportionate response to protests against the military coup. If we look at it from all of that, what does all of this mean on the ground? How is this translating on the ground? Because what happens at the political level, it does take time to trickle down to how we can see this having an effect at the ground level. And ASEAN has also started a humanitarian assistance effort for Myanmar. There was a pledging conference coordinated by the ASEAN Secretary General a few months ago, and about $8 million were raised, were pledged, and ASEAN has started, I think, the first phase of this humanitarian assistance to Myanmar. But because none of the ASEAN humanitarian actors or agencies can be there on the ground, delivery of aid is being coordinated locally by the Myanmar Red Cross Society. So there is this big question mark about how all this assistance and aid are being delivered and whether they are reaching the communities really in need or not. As we have seen during the latest wave of the COVID-19 spread in Myanmar, the military also weaponized and politicized the COVID-19 response. So right at this point, I think what we're looking at here very broadly is there are so many marginalized communities in Myanmar even before the coup, and there are now even more of these communities that have been displaced as a result of all the violence that has been erupting, and there is also this practice of any community seen or believed to be opposing the military junta will be deprived of aid and assistance. So there are these kinds of, I think, situations that we need to keep our eye on and keep an eye out for. And we also need to look at how the areas and the communities in Myanmar that may not be seen on our television or mobile phone screens whenever news about Myanmar is shown. Mostly we would see urban areas or areas from where I think reports and photos and so on can be sent, making use of internet technology. But in areas where internet has been cut by the military, areas that do not have that much, I guess, immediacy of access to the kind of information sharing that all of us are used to in the world, we are seeing, these types of agricultural or farming communities affected very much by the economic deterioration going on and the limitations of cash flow, of access to cash. What does this mean for the farmers? If they cannot get the kind of ready access to credit, that means that crop planting for the cycle of the monsoon will be affected. If crop planting is effective, the farming communities, if the agriculture communities are affected, if they miss this monsoon season for sowing the crops for harvest later on, this can only contribute to the kind of food shortages and food insecurity challenges that we are starting to see as a result of people not being able to pursue their everyday livelihoods. In the urban areas, this means, of course, many of the workers in the factories, in the manufacturing sectors, and so on, are also looking at losing their jobs, and or basically employment security becoming very precarious. And I think across the country, we're also seeing situations where many households will be considering selling, I guess, what could be termed their long-term assets, their property, their houses. For farmers, this may mean their cows and so on, their livestock. All of these kinds of assets, people are now considering selling these assets to meet the much more immediate needs of food or medicine, with regard to the continuing situation of the fear of the COVID infection spread. So I think these are the realities on the ground that we all need to be aware about whenever we start thinking about and formulating policies in respective capitals. Right now, as we speak, Chin State, that is in the northwestern part of Myanmar, Chin State is burning. Thousands have been displaced and are now forced to seek shelter from all that, fighting and clashes that are going on. And so we have, many people, women, children, elderly, having to, I think, seek shelter in jungles. And all these displaced communities all have very practical needs: medicine, clean water, and also for the women, there will be gender-specific needs as well. And add to that the ongoing arrests, detentions, forced disappearances, and the continued, I think, weaponization of internet access. Many areas in Myanmar have suffered shutdown of mobile internet access. These are all the kinds of, I think, realities on the ground that the people are facing. And what does all this mean? I mean, how do you even buy basic commodities? How do you have the means and the wherewithal to buy basic commodities in such a situation? In urban areas where there are some form of mobile internet access and so on, there are still very severe and limited cash withdrawal opportunities from the ATMs and so on. And those who manage to, I think, try to get cash still have to pay transaction costs and fees. And so a lot of people are resorting to, I guess, wireless, cashless transfers via mobile technology. That works in areas where there is mobile internet access, as well as for people who do have those kinds of, I guess, electronic transaction accounts. And of course, for the businesses, the supermarkets, and so on that have participated in the Myanmar Payments Union, which is something like an electronic nets payment system. So that is how I think people are trying to get by. But in the more rural areas where you don't really have that kind of internet access via mobile technology, and also where basic needs are very glaring, how are all this panning out? Of course, along the Thai-Myanmar border, I think where, due to the 7 decades of civil war that the country has been going through since almost the time of independence in 1948, over there, the ethnic health and education services networks have built up the capacity and I think the skills, so to speak, to attend to the needs of their indigenous, their local communities in terms of education and health services. And that is how they have tried to cope during the earlier waves of COVID-19. But now, due to all these, heightened clashes going on across the country, there is, I think, a rise in an increase in the people fleeing conflict, people spilling over the border, and even these existing well-functioning ethnic education and health services networks, particularly the health services networks now, are also going to be very much stretched and under pressure in having to deal with a much higher influx of people in need. So I could go on, but I think I shall stop here to give the floor to other panelists to round out what I've been presenting. And I apologize if sometimes the emotion I feel for my country and my people have affected the quality of my discussion.
Thank you so much, Mo, for this excellent presentation where you managed to explain to all of us the high political issues, and especially the fact that the ASEAN credibility was at stake because of the fact that the military junta has backtracked on the consensus that was agreed between all the ASEAN member states, and also to transform this and to move from these high political discussions on the impact on the ground for the citizens and the reality on the ground. It's very important, of course, to understand what the reality on the ground, because these are issues which are directly affecting the livelihood of millions of people. Thank you so much again for this for your presentation. I will now give the floor to our second speaker, Mrs. Claudine Henny, who will, from Bridging Changes, who will review or discuss with us the international response to the Myanmar crisis, and also cover the role of the United Nations platform, while at the same time taking stock of the peace building and humanitarian needs of the communities in Myanmar. So Claudine, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Perhaps start by saying international community is a misnomer, because actually ASEAN is also part of the international community. I've been asked to take stock of the approaches up to now, and then see what the response was and what are potential openings for constructive engagement. I think the international response, barring ASEAN, which Motuzar explained very well, from the UN side, it's been stymied. Overall, countries, the Western countries, and I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about international response. We have to distinguish that the bilateral reactions, the UN reactions, bilateral of the UN, of Western countries and of other countries, because obviously Russia, China, to an extent India, have had different reactions than, I would say, the Western Bloc. For the Western Bloc, it's been very much power. We're trying to force you to backtrack. It has been support to an extent for the opposition, NUG, and other opposition forces. But at the same time, the support has not gone as far as official recognition. The recognition is a question which I'd come back to afterwards. Whereas other countries, Russia, business as usual, if not business better than usual. China, after hesitating a bit, has begun to resume business as usual. India is a bit more on the fence, but is also cautiously re-engaging. I think the Western response has been stymied around what I would consider perhaps a wrong dichotomy. Engaging does not mean recognizing or being in favor of what has happened. Engaging often is a question of realpolitik. If you want to engage, if you want to further certain things, you have to engage with people. You can't put somebody out in the cold and say, we don't agree with you, without having any kind of discussion. So for the moment, the Western countries have tried to ignore the SAC and do their business without engaging with where we're sitting in Naypyidaw right now. Engaging with the NUG has proved problematic because the NUG has no effective control, and therefore they cannot further the agendas by sole engagement with the NUG. This brings me to what have the approaches been in terms of development, peace building and humanitarian. I would say the approaches right now have lacked major strategic reflection. It has been decided that development aid stops as long as it has to go through government structures, which means the government as an institution is no longer being built up. And I would hold that this has been one of the problems in Myanmar, is that the government exists, but has never been strengthened in terms of accountability and transparency properly. So development aid in the classic sense has stopped. Everything is supposed to go through civil society. There again, I would, while understanding the political imperative, I would just point out that civil society has been decimated over the past 20 years. And it is not clear that the civil society could absorb all the aid that is necessary, whether it is development or humanitarian aid, let alone distribute it. Added to that, by the more you engage civil society, the more you make them visible and therefore also possible target of sanctions. And added to that, hardline stance on both sides of the equation, both with the SAC and with the NUG, where both sides say, if you support the other side, you will be sanctioned. Which means, in general, we're seeing a closing of space where people are allowed not to choose. People are increasingly being forced to choose to work with one or the other camp. People no longer have the option to say, I just want to get the work done. I just want to do my humanitarian aid. I just want to help my community. For peace building, I think peace building per se has been put on the back burner. The peace building for the moment has room to say, well, there has to be dialogue between the military and the NUG. I think that is a short-sighted approach because it does not recognize that the opposition in Myanmar is multifaceted. NUG, together with the CDM, the civil disobedience movement, together with the ethnic armed organizations, together with the PDFs, form very different poles of opposition today. And while they all agree that they don't like Tamadaw and they want the army to leave, I do not think that they have an agreement on what the end state of Myanmar should be post-coup. I think there are very different visions there, and there has been no space to even start talking about these visions, which personally I believe is not helpful towards peace building in general. And as long as the international discourse is the army has to liberate everybody and start discussing with the NUG, I think the conflict in Myanmar will continue a great deal longer than is anticipated. Finally, the backdrop of humanitarian, which is always your ultima ratio. There are attempts, again, to deliver humanitarian aid with the same challenges as I pointed out for development for civil society. Increasing attempts to deliver humanitarian aid cross-border, but without clear discussions happening with the Thai authorities and how the Thai authorities could manage that, together with their national strategic interest not to have problems with their neighbors. So that is a very fine line for Thailand to walk. And I'm not sure that the Western international community is always aware of that or willing to take that into consideration. So humanitarian efforts are being made. I think WFP is trying very hard to deliver to those in need. But in order to do so, WFP, as other UN and agencies and the Red Cross, have to engage with whoever is sitting in the administrative power in Naypyidaw right now and are coming under pressure for doing that. So what we're seeing is that the instrumentalization and the weaponization, as Motuzar very correctly said, of the COVID response, of the humanitarian response, it's not just the SAC, it's also the opposition. And ultimately, it's the people who are in need that are going to suffer. But this goes back to the bigger picture I was drawing of the increasingly inexistent space for some kind of neutral discussion. Finally, and I'm making it brief, Xavier, what does this mean for potential openings for constructive engagement? I think right now the challenge is that what one would call constructive engagement is seen as support by the other side. There is very little room for constructive engagement. And I think that also holds true in terms of whom are you talking to and what does talking to really mean. Again, I think it would be helpful to remind that you do not recognize a government, you recognize a state. Ironically, it was the Brits that had the longest tradition of recognizing governments until they decided that it was a lot too much work to congratulate a new government every time one was elected. Many countries consider recognizing a government interference in internal matters, and not just Myanmar, but also a lot of South American, Latin American countries, a lot of African countries. Even European countries would be somewhat miffed if countries were to write to them to congratulate them on the successful elections. So I think that is, if there would be room for engagement, it would be to have this discussion. What does recognition mean, and how can you engage constructively with the parties, all parties? I do not think that you can solve the issue in Myanmar without engaging at some point with the military, and in particular with Min Aung Hlaing. I fully understand ASEAN's decision, and I think in this particular context, it was probably the right thing to do. But medium-term wise, this conflict cannot be solved without engaging somehow with the leaders on all sides. And there are many leaders, which I think is part of the challenge. So this whole discussion around engagement, recognition, legitimacy, I think is probably not helpful in terms of peace building. Where does this leave the international community with the people of Myanmar? I think there were very many false expectations. If people wanted the international community to intervene, nothing short of boots on the ground would help. Now, I cannot think of a single situation today in which there was a military coup by a fairly strong military, and in which the UN was agreed to send in troops to undo the coup, let alone contributing countries sending troops in to what be a certain combat and casualties on their side. So I think there's probably at some stage of the game, we have to review expectations of the international community, independently of the fact that Myanmar has its protectors, that the Security Council will never agree to have a sanction against Myanmar as long as Russia and China don't want to do this. But even if the Security Council did come to an agreement, how far could they go in reality? And this leaves me to say that, sadly, the best thing you can do is support the forces in Myanmar. Personally, I think it would be helpful to help the opposition come to a broader agreement than just we want the military out of power. And a decided push by the international community to create spaces for dialogue within Myanmar, to encourage people not to weaponize what traditionally were neutral spaces, like humanitarian spaces, like medical aid, like education, and to keep these spaces open and to let everybody participate independently of whom they would like to support. This leaves me then with a fairly pessimistic conclusion that the international engagement is dithering. I can understand why, again, there was a lot of pressure on Western businesses to pull out, but that means that the two things, that means that the Myanmar economy is in tatters, and that means that it can very, very quickly be bought up by other countries. Now, will that ultimately serve to dislodge the army? I doubt it. Will that ultimately serve to dislodge and help the population? Doubtful. So personally, obviously coming from an organization called Bridging Changes, I personally would think that the only way forward is strategic engagement, not engagement willy-nilly, not engagement that says businesses have to come in straight away, but a strategic engagement which really aims to push and to move the discussion further in order to find a constructive solution for everybody. Thank you. I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, Claudine, for this very clear and precise, if not too optimistic, presentation, and insisting on the need to engage. Constructive engagements reminds me of the discussion with SLORC and SPDC a few years ago, which is not good news to go backwards 10 to 15 years. Strategic engagement is a different concept, and thank you for introducing this concept. And also thank you, I think both you and Moa agree that delivery of aid is difficult. If it is through the government or even through the Myanmar Red Cross is difficult, it poses questions. But to rely only on civil society is also a difficult situation and may put civil society in at risk, as you explained very well, when they have to choose side. Maybe later on we will come back also on the situation of Thailand along the border, because I think it's an interesting topic also to see how
Sorry,
the time.
If I may just add, I think to engage or not to engage has always been the question. Throughout Myanmar's history, throughout various regimes. And I think it always, so there is no right or wrong. But I think whenever you've had regime change, it has been a combination of engagement and pressure. You can't have one and not have the other. Mm. So I know that a lot of people are saying we should have never engaged. People were blue-eyed or naive. I think you have to have both. It's in human nature. So I agree with you that it might sound like the same discussion 20 years ago, but Myanmar today in 2021 is very different from Myanmar in 1992. And that's what we have to take into consideration as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's very interesting because now we're going to see with our third speaker what the private business can do, if private business can still be a driver for change and bring values for the citizens of Myanmar without supporting the military regime. So I'll give the floor to Felix Haas for 15 minutes to discuss on the economic development in Myanmar and the impact on the private business.
Yeah, thank you so much, Xavier, and to the European Institute of Asian Studies overall for hosting this, I think, very relevant and useful discussion. As said, I would like to highlight the role of the private sector, because this oftentimes seems to have been a view that has not necessarily been reflected, given its significance. We shall not forget, when we speak about the private sector, that we are talking about an actor of civil society, and not only one actor, but a diversified set of actors that are contributing in a sustainable way to, in fact, engagement between people doing business together. So in fact, we have here a very valuable link to the private sector that we should become aware of. And I would like to take the opportunity at this stage, not only to reflect what has happened since 1st of February, but rather to present the broader underpinnings of where the private sector has been standing, how it has been emerging, and where then the situation is now, given the developments that we have seen over the last month. So let me start a bit back in history. After 1988, Myanmar emerged from the Burmese way of socialism, and the economy was at that time dominated by state-owned enterprises, and there was very little room for engagement for private business. That was the time after 1988, after the first, let's say, wave of democratization. We saw then in the mid-1990s, in fact, the emergence of a diversified private sector, a domestic private sector that was, in fact, capitalizing on these opportunities, these only opportunities that were there at that time, which were primarily contracts, implementation contracts, licenses, concessions that were provided by the SLORC at that time, by the State Law and Order Restoration Council. And what I would like to highlight here, I mean, trying to learn basically from the history, is that Myanmar has not just undergone another opening in the 2010s with the same process being repeated, but we are now miles ahead, in fact, where all these businesses that were labeled at some point of time as the SDNs, where these businesses have in fact developed principles, have diversified, and have established any kind of safeguards in terms of transparency, focus on sustainability, and all. And these businesses also in the country, family-led conglomerates, had also had an opportunity, in fact, to undergo generational change with young business leaders in charge. So I think, this core of really the conglomerate sector in Myanmar, I think is a very crucial perspective that also one needs to understand, because business at this moment is silent, and we shall not lose overview over these important players, in fact, in the market. Then looking forward in the following years, in 2003, we had one of the major failures of diplomatic engagement with regard to Myanmar, the imposition of sanctions that had wiped out large parts of the economy, and that from one day to another, in fact, led to the unemployment of hundreds of thousands of garment workers. So, I did hear in some discussions, in civil society circles, calls for sanctions and the like. And this, just a look at the history would demonstrate that certain tools, shall not be considered and have led to any of the hardship that one may anticipate. Looking further, I think in terms of what Claudine highlighted, it is very important to understand that then in the early 2000s, much of the opening and the transformation process, the roadmap to democracy, in fact, was pursued under Senior General Tan Shui. And the 2008 constitution was basically brought forward and developed under the military rule. So, that I think in terms of engagement, where can we move without engagement with the Tamador side in whatever sense, that it seems to be not realistic given the involvement that the army itself has had in actually shepherding this democratization and opening path. Then I think, we are back in the kind of sphere of what I think we all have witnessed, the Thein Sein administration, at first the 2010 and 2012 elections and by-elections that have led to the really transformation of the country's social and economic reforms. But I think that's then where I think we need to calibrate how we look at the future, basically, of the private sector, then especially under the NLD administration. I think there are certain friction points that have not really found too much attention in the media, but that have been, obviously well documented when we look back just 5 years. And this is a point that I would like to highlight, that at the beginning of the NLD, National League for Democracy term, in fact, very little economic policies had been communicated for a period of approximately 2 years. We had been at a situation where newspaper articles were titled, "Where is the economic policy of NLD? What is NLD pursuing?" and the like. And it took then till around 2017-18 for NLD to come up actually with a set of well-diversified and focused views on the economy. What I would like to highlight in this sense, that one of the type of conflicts that hasn't found attention is here, to what extent the economic policies pursued under NLD have actually been in conflict with the grown structures within the private sector. NLD's policies have focused on the services sectors in Myanmar, on the banking, on the insurance, and, for instance, the trading sectors. And they have meant a liberalization as per Washington consensus. So clearly the policies that were put forward at that time had focused on the creation of not only a level playing field, but clear entry points for international investment in Myanmar. And that may, as a point of friction, not have harmonized, obviously, with the local interests of the local conglomerates. And I think this is one of the kind of key conflicts that may not have found that level of attention, but that may have been also important. How did the local established businesses, the largest employers of the country, actually have seen the developments? So with that, I mean, let me, take a look a bit at what has happened after the 1st of February and just provide a brief a bit on the economic status. First of all, let's start with a number. I think many are aware about a growth forecast of minus 18% that was published by the World Bank. And what we need to say is, though, that we need to see this in separation from the political developments. This type of forecast would focus or would analyze what the likely developments would be in the economy in different subsectors, just based on the assumption how long these subsectors would be impacted by, in particular, the COVID-19 pandemic. How long would tourism not be possible? How long would trading be disrupted and the like? So, I mean, we need to take these numbers with a bit of caution because they are just based on the time frame that we assume the economy, like many economies in the region, would be closed. When we now look at the status of the economy, I would say that Myanmar's economy has suffered since the 1st of February for different reasons. Firstly, because of being import dependent due to a lack of the diversification of the manufacturing base. And this, in combination with some degree of dollarization in the economy, has led to the challenges that we have seen. What that means is, I mean, that Myanmar, of course, by no means is dollarized as other economies from Venezuela to Zimbabwe, but that the dollar or that foreign currency gold is far more accessible than it would be in Europe to anyone who would fear a depreciation of the local currency. So all of this has certainly led to consumer prices, in fact, then increasing because people were, in fact, fleeing into foreign currency because they saw certain challenges coming ahead, and they saw the likelihood that that the Myanmar Chat would depreciate. Also, in addition, we might need to notice that the reforms actually of how the exchange rate was, utilized was based on a reform undertaken under the NLD government, in which a protective band of how much the exchange rate could fluctuate from day to day was, in fact, removed. So I think we have seen many of the challenges based on these underlying constraints that have been there vis-a-vis the banking sector. In addition, what we certainly have seen for private business here are transactional challenges, carrying out business, basic transactions. I mean, this has, I think, caused a major headache for entrepreneurs and established businesses here. And certainly the security situation, along with reputation risks, has not contributed to business confidence. So what we have, I mean, just to highlight a few points of what I think is important in the economy. We had, as I said, the exchange rate fluctuations that led to people fleeing into the US dollar, for instance, and therefore, the issue of a downward spiral, this seems to have been addressed, and that issue seems to have been tackled. Overall, we see now more restrictive measures on foreign exchange, repatriation of capital, and the like. So more measures to actually keep foreign currency, to keep Forex within the country. We, of course, need to recognize that Myanmar is an economy based on migrant labor, on remittances. This is an important part. During a world of COVID-19, it has been very challenging for people actually to send money back and to leave the country to travel. So all of this has also contributed to hardship of the population. And I think some of the biggest issues that we have seen would be related to, of course, the closure of border trade with China, which in fact had been the market and the source of the market for many agricultural products and the source for many consumer items. So, I mean, here really the challenges are these disruptions that have been mainly due to COVID-19 rather than political issues. I would like to perhaps in the last 1 or 2 minutes just talk about the ways in which I think the private sector as an important actor of civil society could be strengthened, and the ways in which the European Union or other international actors could see the situation. And I would first of all, second, I think many points, especially Claudine had mentioned, regarding the need for engagement, not for endorsement, not for goodwill, but for simple engagement with all the stakeholders as to create a better situation together through dialogue. From a private sector perspective, though, I think the first point would be on a strategic level. The European Union would need to see what is the European Union and the member states are willing to achieve through their engagement. What is the level of footprint that Europe or also North America, basically the political West, would like to have in the country through its private sector or also on a diplomatic level? That I think is a very important point. So what is actually the positioning between the European Union and ASEAN when one ASEAN member state had been absent in the core meeting? From a private sector side, also, I think it has been a very challenging situation, because especially private business got dragged into this type of conflict. Foreign chambers of commerce had not been able to freely communicate, even with their members, to organize public events. And there had been a lot of pressure on this civil society actor, private sector, which I think has been without major rationale, given the importance of business and of economic engagement with Myanmar and with the Myanmar people. So really politics would need to find a way how to depoliticize the private sector and economic engagement, and how to, in fact, enable a private sector not to be put in a position to pick sides between, for instance, engaging with a regulator or engaging with a government in exile. That certainly cannot be the purpose of meaningful economic engagement. Also, when we look at the other kind of engagement that Asian powers would certainly show in Myanmar. So in terms of the way forward, I think as also Mo and Claudine stated, I think one needs to take a broader and more strategic view on things. I believe many of the scenarios that have been drawn up by the European Union and by other actors have been based on what we had seen in perhaps March and April of this year. And there were scenarios called a failed state scenario. There is this very simple scenario of talking about an economic collapse. But I mean, all these scenarios are not looking at the detail and are not analyzing, in fact, the entry points that can be there. So what I believe would need to be done is a strategic view of what are the values, in fact, and what are the principles in which we would wish to, in fact, engage as Europe. What are the things that we would wish what we would wish to contribute to Myanmar, to set out these principles, to look at the scenarios that are possible realistically under the current circumstances, and to really look at the likelihood of these scenarios. This is what a business would do. A business has a certain objective and a certain target, and would then form scenarios and likelihoods in order to determine pathways how to get there. And I believe then it would be about realizing who can, in fact, then accomplish and contribute to any of these scenarios. What kind of engagement with NEPIDOR might be strategic to improve a certain situation? What kind of engagement with border-based actors might be strategic to attain a certain objective? And what kind of international engagement through the UN platform might be helpful? And we might also need to look at what is going to happen in Myanmar over the next 2 years. We cannot just have reactive policies, but we do need to have a vision forward. What likely are the things that are going to happen, and what are we going to anticipate? With that, I would like to conclude my presentation, and obviously I'm very happy to discuss further then on specific sectors or on different views from the private sector community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felix. And indeed, you have a major question there, especially about the EU. What is the EU strategy? What is the EU vision for the future? And this is always the most difficult in the long term. For the moment, clearly, the EU has to stick to its principles of democracy and rule of law. And also, you insisted very much on the fact that the disruption of the economy in the country was largely due to COVID-19, which is very true, because we saw that the other economies from the neighborhood countries also had quite a lot of difficulties to manage the consequences of COVID-19. But nevertheless, responsibility still lays with the military for disrupting the normal process of opening up and engaging the private sector and the international community in the development of the country. You have a very strong view on the sanctions, or the usefulness or not of sanctions. That's a long debate. There are different views on that, and we may come back to this. So now, just to remind everybody that you can raise questions through the chat if you wish on any of our three speakers. We already have a few questions, notably about the fact that if we isolate the country, maybe this is what the military wants. And we saw that in the past, Myanmar was a closed economy, and for the military, it was all well for many, many years. And that's what I said also in my introduction, that the military does not seem to bow down to any pressure from outside as yet. So the risk, of course, is if we don't engage with the military, which is debatable, that may play in the hands of the military. So maybe our views, your views of speakers can be shared on this. Maybe we start with this, the isolation of Myanmar. Maybe more, you have something with your long experience, of course, of Myanmar. Do you think that isolation is one of the goals of the military junta for the moment?
Thank you, Xavier. I lived part of my young adulthood in a Myanmar that was, isolated in that sense from the international community. Among the the career diplomats in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at that time, we had more constructivist views towards Myanmar participating, Myanmar being in the international mainstream as a way of exposing the generals to observing, to seeing how things were done, how developments were evolving in the world and the region around us, and through that to try and want to work for change. So that was the constructivist approach of learning through exposure. And that was also one of the motivations of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs initiative to persuade the generals to see the merits, the potential of becoming a member of ASEAN. So ASEAN's constructive engagement in that sense was something that I think for the technocrats, at least in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, something that we felt that it could be opening up and learning towards the kind of future that the Myanmar people visioned. So if you talk about do the generals want to be isolated, I think we've heard and read reports earlier on about the Vice Senior General of the State Administration Council mentioning that they are ready to walk with a few friends. But as Claudine has observed, 2021 is very different from the early to mid 1990s, and the fact that Myanmar, being a member of ASEAN, is participating in the ASEAN Economic Community initiatives, part of the nodes of the ASEAN connectivity, supply chains, and so on. What do we mean by then isolation in that sense? And I think it's because ASEAN does not want to see Myanmar, the state, Myanmar, the country, and, by extension, the Myanmar people isolated, that it is trying to do what it is doing in terms of this kind of pragmatic way of engaging the state, or Myanmar as a member state, if you will. And this is the context in which we need to view the recent disinvite to the summit. It is disinviting Min Aung Hlaing to the summit, but as I mentioned, the daily coordination of work, the business as usual meetings, and the discussions that go on in every sector of ASEAN cooperation still have a representative, a participation from Myanmar. And I think ASEAN has that in mind in terms of, not suspending Myanmar as a member state as yet, but it is making it very clear about how it wishes to engage with the State Administration Council, and that is within the context of the ASEAN 5-point consensus principle, which again looks toward that kind of constructive outcome that can be achieved, which, as Claudine has again very well highlighted, it seems well nigh a very big challenge right now with the kind of polarized attitudes that are on both sides. So I think that's how it is in terms of wanting to be isolated or wishing to be isolated and so on. And of course, again, going back to another point that Claudine has highlighted, the possibility of what that isolation may entail for broader international strategic implications.
Still, if I may, on this issue of isolation, the ASEM meeting, and I think you have mentioned this ASEM meeting in your presentation. The ASEM meeting will take place on 26th of November, if I'm correct, in virtually, but organized by Cambodia. What will be the position of ASEAN and of the other ASEM, if you know, about the participation of Myanmar? Are we going to see the Senior General sitting together with all the heads of state of the European countries? Maybe Claudine also, you have a word to say on that. Mo?
I would view the ASEAN decision to disinvite the State Administration Council sitting in Myanmar's seat at the key high-level political meeting. And the ASEAN Summit is ASEAN's highest level political meeting. So that decision sets a precedent of how other high-level summits, whether it is in the ASEAN and dialogue partner context or whether it is in that broader Asia-Europe context, I think the ASEAN decision does set a precedent. So now Mr. Hun Sen will be taking that precedent into consideration, I would assume, when he makes the decision, when he consults. After all, Asia-Europe meeting is not purely ASEAN. Yeah, the ASEAN decision was reached with among the by discussion and agreement of the 9 ASEAN member states, noting Myanmar's reservation on this. But that was how it was done. It was a negotiated consensus. And so for the ASEM meeting, the Asia-Europe meeting, of course, then the participants, the countries that are going to be sitting around the virtual platform or table will, of course, their views will also count. So it's not just the ASEAN members, but it's also who else are the members in the Asia-Europe meeting.
But if I'm not mistaken, it's the Asian countries, the Asian side, not ASEAN, but Asian side that decide who are the members of the Asian side, not the European countries. So it will be a decision by all the Asian countries to see if Myanmar is being invited or not. So it will be a very interesting moment. I don't know if Claudine or Felix, you have something to add on this ASEM meeting and on isolation.
Yes, thank you very much. Just building on what Murtuza already said. First of all, the Brits have already said that if Min Aung Hlaing comes, they're not going. So basically what ASEAN is faced with, what they hate, is that they have to choose. In this particular instance, since they already have the precedent, I think it's unlikely that Min Aung Hlaing will be invited. Because the whole idea of an ASEM meeting is having the Europeans there and others. So there's no point having an ASEM meeting if they're not going to come. In terms of the isolation, I see that slightly. I see it the same way as Murtuza does, but I would maybe reframe it slightly. I do not think that the military were looking for isolation, but the view is we've already been isolated before, and if that's what is needed, then we'll live through it again. I think they severely underestimated the reaction that they were going to get. They thought people would be a bit alatai. People are going to be unhappy for a couple of months and then it will be okay. And they underestimated the reaction. Again, because Myanmar 2021 is not even Thailand in 2017. Between social media and all that just meant that the opposition to this was much stronger and was much further broadcast, and therefore had a different kind of support also abroad. So I don't think they were looking for isolation, but for them they're going to have to weather it because they don't have another choice. They're not willing to back down. Are they looking for isolation? No, because what does isolation mean? They're precisely forced to count on allies they actually don't really want to count on, such as China. They always were looking for, at least in my reading, were looking for connectivity and contact to the West as a way of balancing China's preponderant influence. So on that one, they've gone back a step themselves, and I'm pretty sure that they're going to be looking to come out of that isolation, I would think, in a not all too distant future. And for what price? I think that remains open. They're not willing to come out of it at any price. They have limits. And one limit certainly will be they do not want NLD back in power again, ever. Whether that is an acceptable price for the rest of the world is a different question. Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps let me also add a few points here. I would agree that isolation is not, it should not be the objective here of NEPIDO. I mean, at the moment, we have a certain situation of monologue. We do have, obviously, the state media publishing media like the Global New Light of Myanmar, speeches by the senior general. So, I mean, it fairly is clear what NEPIDO is trying to do, what its principles are. But, I mean, there's simply no one to basically engage on this. And there's no one to basically provide any alternatives, basically building on this. I mean, in terms of the isolation, therefore, I mean, it really is something that I think Myanmar, as the government of Myanmar, must take under these circumstances. The question is, what is the significance of the European side and the European engagement in Myanmar, as well as, for instance, the North American engagement, and certainly the leverage that the West would have on NEPIDO itself is certainly limited. Now, all the basically force, the diplomatic force, has been diverted on the different ASEAN member states. I mean, we know obviously the meeting history. I mean, of the U.S. envoy, for instance, then to Singapore, and I mean we know about the financial interdependencies, of course, between Myanmar and Singapore, and also about the geostrategic role that Singapore certainly is there looking to play. So, and all this indirect pressure that has been there on the region, on ASEAN in itself, has now led to the most significant crisis that this bloc had been in. I think I think everything had been expectable because the meeting requests that were sent to NEPIDO as per communication in the Global New Light of Myanmar were basically contained something in the lines of NUG to my mind. So I mean, there had been certain points that I mean, from an ASEAN perspective, from a Bruneian perspective, I mean, that would have needed to lead to the breakdown of communications. and that at the time when Brunei was in fact finishing its chairmanship. Without now drawing conclusions, but I mean, it probably from the Bruneian side, I mean, no success having made to that extent. I mean, it had certainly been a way out, and the question is now what Cambodia will be doing with this kind of fracture within the bloc. I mean, are tensions going to be further exacerbated, or is any reconciliation of ASEAN here in the focus to maintain stability and integrity of the bloc and to avoid what ASEAN, I think, was following as an objective to prevent any type of issues, ranging from even the balkanization of Myanmar to other regional strategic stability interests. And I think that's I think the point at where we are, where we need to ask ourselves, and what kind of role do we want to ASEAN to play, to just be an ambassador of the European Union or of the United States towards Myanmar, or do we want to find a more constructive role where ASEAN can engage with all the stakeholders, given its certain level of neutrality?
Yes,
Xavier, if I could jump in here, because I think Felix's point is rather interesting for I think further dissection, in the sense that we are assuming ASEAN has no agency apart than being the mouthpiece of its dialogue partners. I think that's a wrong assumption to make here. The fact that ASEAN has made the kind of decision it has made within the bounds of what it has set up for itself under the ASEAN Charter shows the interest and the commitment that ASEAN member states are willing to see how these so-called time-honored principles can be made more flexible in the name of regional stability and security. And again, Myanmar has time and again been the case and the example where the non-intervention principle and the consensus principle have been made very flexible in the name of maintaining regional stability and security. So I think we need to be a bit careful about saying that, or implying that ASEAN does not have agency. The fact that this precedent has been set means Mr. Hun Sen will be referring to that precedent, not just for the Asia-Europe meetings, Xavier, but for the whole of Cambodia's chairmanship year coming in 2022, including how Cambodia, representing ASEAN as the ASEAN chair, will continue with the 5-point consensus, which again is not about isolation. If anything, ASEAN came under flack for continuing to engage, as many people saw it, with the junta, with the military junta, in the name of trying to bring back some form of normalcy to the country, to stop the violence and to try and mediate some kind of constructive outcome. And yes, Felix, yes, if you read the Global New Light of Myanmar, of course, you will see what the current authorities in power wish to present as the justification. The request of the special envoy was to meet, in line with his mandate, all key stakeholders. And key stakeholders do include the National League for Democracy. I do not think he mentioned the National Unity Government, but he did mention meeting with representatives of a legitimate political party. And I think that request was valid. So again, I apologize for jumping in, but I do think that ASEAN does have some agency in this. And I think it's also because of this perception that ASEAN does still have some agency is why the international community at large is willing to support what ASEAN is doing as kind of like letting ASEAN sort of take the charge, take the lead, and maybe, I don't want to say following behind it, but also seeing what ASEAN does and maybe supplementing it or complementing it. But I think this is the crux of what we're looking at now. If we have to engage, how do we engage and to what end? And here again, if you talk about history, it's important. The history of what the military has done, the way that it has entrenched its privileged role in the country's political and economic life is something that the people in Myanmar do not forget. And I think that's what's fueling what's going on right now. So I mean, those of us who really want to try and bring about, I think that moderate view and look and that constructive way out, this is the challenge that all of us face. I'm sorry, again, for jumping in and be passionate about it.
It's all right. It's very important indeed that the ASEAN has been willing to engage. I mean, the 5-point consensus was clearly requesting or asking to discuss and to have a dialogue with all stakeholders. So it's a clear way to engage. But of course, Myanmar is not a follow-up on this recommendation. And the decision not to invite the Senior General to the ASEAN summit is very interesting also in the medium to long term, as you mentioned, because we will see if it is a major shift in ASEAN principle or not, or if it is a one-shot or not. But let's move a little bit to another topic. I have questions about the economy and questions for Felix Haas, and I will read the question to be very precise. One question is about Telenor, the Norwegian telecommunication company, looking to exit Myanmar, and I think they've already suspended their activities, and also EDF, the French electrical company, suspending an hydro project. The question is, what do those cases tell about doing business under the new regime? The fact that those very large European companies are withdrawing or suspending. And there's another linked question, which is linked also for Felix. Has the boycott of products from military-linked or military-run companies such as Myanmar Beer with Kirin had any impact on the junta actions? So 2 questions about European companies withdrawing and on the Asian companies which have joint ventures with military-controlled businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, it's very clear what the impact of these decisions in fact had been. It of course is, and we are not talking about just these 2 companies. We are also talking about the German firm Metro that has been engaged in building up a sustainable supply chain within Myanmar and has entered with, I mean, over several attempts, in fact, in a quite innovative way. And it really is regrettable that these companies have decided to, in fact, pull out. I think Telenor had been in a very difficult situation specifically, given, I mean, obviously its shareholding and given also its focus and exposure as being part of the telecommunications sector, being impacted by orders basically to suspend access to certain websites and the like. So I mean, these had all been challenges. What I did here basically in addition is that also, I mean, there had been security challenges even around these assets, basically the tower sites in many respects. So it really is a regrettable situation for a company as Telenor. Looking at the sanction impact, I mean, first of all, I would say that there are 2 things that we need to distinguish. The first are the actual sanctions implemented by, for instance, the European Commission, etc., which have been targeted sanctions and which had focused on the military holding companies. And then we need to distinguish how have the people actually reacted to these military-owned enterprises. And I think what even had a greater impact than the sanction itself coming from outside have been actually the consumer boycotts that have been there within Myanmar, of, for instance, Myanmar Beer, of other kind of products that would come from the military holding companies. So I believe that has proven effective. How significant these lines of business really are as compared to what opportunities economically the military is holding, I'm not sure about it. But let's say, I mean, I think these have been certainly sanctions that have been or targets that had allowed to really, calibrate on a business that specifically had been serving the interests of the military. So I believe in that sense it had been effective. I mean, how it has changed, the the posture of the military, I wouldn't be able to comment on it. But I think beyond the sanctioning of companies, I think the sanctioning of officials, including, for instance, the reformist and forward-looking government officials, for instance, like Aung Naing Oo, who has been shepherding under the previous two governments economic reforms in the country. I mean, the sanctioning of these people, I mean, certainly, I mean, I don't think, I mean, has, I mean, would open up, specific dialogue and would contribute in any way to any change. So it unfortunately, I mean, it has led to a situation where, I mean, at what level can engagement now take place, even between the European Union side and Naypyidaw, if so desired, beyond any humanitarian interactions?
Thank you. And maybe along those lines also, because if some international or foreign companies withdraw from Myanmar with all the consequences, and you may agree or disagree with that, but what impact can it really have, considering that probably from Thailand, the business will still go on? So maybe we can come back also with this position of the Thai government. What is exactly the position of the Thai government with regard to this new regime in Myanmar, and specifically on the business relation? Who wants to, who has a better knowledge of what the Thai government can act? Claudine or Mo? Who wants to say something about the position of the Thai government?
I think I've been hogging the mic too much, but you see, my program at EIAS, the Myanmar Studies program, we just had a joint webinar with the Thai Studies program on Thailand's role in the Myanmar crisis. And we had former permanent secretary from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand, Ambassador Sihasak Pongkakiao, to share his views. So again, I think Thailand's position in all of this, and of course, when you talk about Thailand's position, Xavier, you're also looking at the current administration in Thailand and their position, right? Yeah, rather than Thailand, the state's position. So,
absolutely,
well,
yes.
So we are looking at a long and very involved history of bilateral relations between the two countries as a backdrop and as a context to all of this. We are looking at close military to military ties over the decades, and the nature of who is in the seat in the executive seat in Thailand right now. But taking all of that into consideration, I think one thing that's coming out very clearly is Thailand also views what's happening in Myanmar also as part of regional security, as well as its own security and domestic interest in that sense. So this is how I think when we discuss and frame the crisis in Myanmar, it is all related to how that affects the domestic situation, especially in the neighboring countries. So with COVID-19, for example, what we're seeing, right? There is this concern about COVID-19 spilling over into Thai borders, across Thai borders. There is this concern about the increase in the influx of the people fleeing conflict and now finding refuge along the many areas along the Thai-Myanmar border. And the interest in having humanitarian corridors reopened, reactivated, or set up again as they were post-1988 to reach the communities in need across the border. And of course, we need to look at that also in conjunction with, say, initiatives like the NUG's COVID-19 task force, which is headed by Dr. Cynthia Mann, whose clinic in Mae Tau, along the Thai-Myanmar border, has been doing great work for communities along the border these past several years and decades. And we also need to look at that in the context of, say, how a country like China, without seeking approval or agreement from the SAC, was also administering COVID-19 vaccines to people in, say, the areas bordering China in Kachin and Shan states and so on. So we need to look at it from the viewpoint of what does the security and stability situation in Myanmar mean for the neighboring countries? And of course, with a country like Thailand, that is always been one of their considerations. But that's talking about the immediate border spillover effects. How about the many Thai investors? And I'm not just talking about the big conglomerates here, but also the other smaller investors, the SMEs and so on, who have invested time and attention in Myanmar. I think from what Ambassador Sihasak shared at our webinar, a summary of which has been posted on the EIAS website, they are there for the long haul, in the sense that they are looking at it from the point of view of whether their continued presence can be of some assistance to the people, the communities within which they are situated, the people they employ, and of course, what kind of humanitarian assistance they can do to the communities that they can reach. So here, I think, just looking at that and extrapolating from that, I think we also need to look at how do the businesses in Myanmar, the various investors and so on, view their responsible business strategies, and what can they do creatively to reach the communities in need, which again, in the unique position as businesses, as private sector, maybe they can transcend some of those very polarized, marginalized lines of aid weaponization or politicization.
Thank you, Mo. And this is really what I wanted to hear, that the relations between Thailand, the government of Thailand and the government of Myanmar are the relations between two military regimes. We know that the General Prayut, Prime Minister Prayut, took power in a similar way as the Myanmar current government, the State Administration Council. So very interesting also to see what you explained about the SMEs, because indeed business is not only about big conglomerates. And by the way, I'm quite happy you mentioned the clinic of Dr. Cynthia, which I had the honor to visit 20 years ago, and she indeed does an extraordinary job for the Myanmar people along the Thai-Burmese border. It was a great pleasure for me to meet her and to spend time with her and working in the clinic. Do we have any other questions or comments? Yes, please, Claudine.
To just complete what Mo said, all of which I agree with completely. I think it would be a bit an oversimplification to assume just because it's a military government here that they are in full agreement with what's happening in Myanmar now. I think if anything, from a Thai perspective, the Thai military managed their coup quite well as opposed to what's happening in Myanmar. They completely avoided the kind of meltdown that's happening in Myanmar. And an economic meltdown in Myanmar would have huge consequences as Thailand. You know that over half of the electricity needs in Bangkok are serviced by Myanmar. So if Myanmar goes down the tube completely, that has immediate impact on Thailand. So Thailand is, I think, more, as we said, is very interested in stability and is trying to keep the border as stable as possible. Don't forget that a lot of the drugs come from Myanmar through Thailand. And there have been concerted efforts now over several years to work on this drug trade and to diminish the drug trade. There have been attempts now. The reason why Thailand is willing to engage in some kind of cross-border humanitarian aid is precisely to work on the COVID, realizing that, like they did with malaria at the time and TB, if you have COVID on the Myanmar side of the border, it can only have an impact on Thailand. So you have to work on both sides of the border. That being said, I'm Swiss and I live next to the French border. Like any land border, the border is extremely porous, which means it is practically impossible to seal it off. So I think if Thailand were given the choice, it would rather sit on the fence and not say anything one way or another. But there is a realpolitik of the reality that they are living in as an important country next to them and with whom they have to maintain some kind of stable relationship. I do not think it means that the Thai military automatically are happy with what's happening in Myanmar, particularly not 9 months later. And therefore, I think whatever engagement has to happen with Thailand needs to be slightly more differentiated than thinking that, well, it's just another military government, therefore they're in agreement.
Yes, of course, I was not trying to say that the coup in Thailand and Myanmar were the same or similar or with the same consequences, but the fact that militaries are in charge in Thailand also helps them to understand the mentality of the military in Myanmar, and they have long-standing relations. I will take a last comment. I don't know if it is a question, it's more like a comment, and it's quite a very interesting comment from Paul Lim, which says that it is clear that the future of Myanmar is in the hands of the people of Myanmar. They should not rely on external partners or actors. I don't know what you think about it, but I suppose most people will agree that the future of Myanmar lies in the people of Myanmar, but should we leave them alone? That's the question I would like to ask you.
I think Paul also had earlier comments about international partners probably not taking enough into consideration what people on the ground are thinking and feeling and so on. So I think, yes, ultimately, and this is also something that some of the heads of state and government among the ASEAN member states have shared in their thoughts. Ultimately, the future of Myanmar lies in the hands of the people of Myanmar. But what's happening right now, of course, is something that is not only very much affecting the stability of the country and the security at many levels across many dimensions of the word security to people's lives and livelihoods. And therefore, this is where ASEAN is trying to intervene constructively through its 5-point consensus response for, I think, the situation, to address the situation of the people of Myanmar. So I think it's that space of trying to get that constructive outcome. But to get to that, of course, right now, in terms of the very polarized views that are existing on the ground, that requires another form of shuttle diplomacy all in itself, and that's how I am seeing that. And the realization, I think, on the ground also is that it's very much the future or the situation right now is in their own hands. And one of the ways of, I think, the forces resisting the coup has taken this up, has interpreted this as also to, I think, to take up their own defense, which has again added to this the violent action-reaction cycle that has been catalyzed by the military takeover. But that military takeover on February the 1st is just another dot in the continuing line of the kind of, I think, very interventionist type of measures that the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, has made towards the country and the people for all these past decades.
Thank you, Claudine. Maybe also you can react to that, and it will be also your conclusion.
Yes, thank you. I'm in a bit of a quandary. I've worked in Myanmar for 8 years, and I've been following Myanmar since. And I believe it's not my role to put oil on the fire. I believe it's on me to try to be as even-handed as possible. Xavier and Mo correctly talked about, or Xavier talked about, the 1,000 and some people who have been killed by the military. But one tends to forget that a lot of non-combatant on the military sides have been assassinated. So I think we have to see both sides. I also would hold that the role of the international community is to guide and to help push towards some kind of negotiated outcome without being naive. Obviously, the Myanmar military is not going to give up a lot of power without some kind of concessions and without some kind of honorable way out, and maybe there is none. So the role of the international community, I think we have to be honest about what we can and what we can't do. If the Western countries were really committed to regime change, they would be delivering weapons. Now, maybe this is no longer possible in a post-Cold War era, but there's not a lot happening in terms of violent overthrow. And I think we have to see in the broader perspective that, as Biden announced, the days of nation building are over, at least for the moment. Ever since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, with all the consequences, I think that's been the clearest message up to now about where international engagement will go. So knowing that, we're only left with soft tools. And I find it difficult sometimes to steer clear. We're back in a situation that there is no impartial reporting on what's happening on Myanmar. You have to piece it together. And I think any kind of intervention will require a very judicious pondering of the pros and the cons and where are we trying to clear. And maybe neutrality is no longer possible. Thank you.
Thank you for this very wise statement. Felix, you have a conclusion on this, and maybe a last view on the strategy that should be followed and the impact on business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, the comment would imply that there's one volonté générale, what the people of Myanmar want. We are speaking about peoples, in fact. I mean, according to the official classification about the 135 different ethnic nationalities in the country. And if we are asking what do the people want, we would need to look at the banners, for instance, that have been held up in protests, for instance. And these banners say something different in Burman areas than they do in ethnic areas. So I mean, we have very different objectives and different views, in fact, on it. And I think we have been looking much too much on just the Burman civilian military dynamics and all these dynamics that were concentrated in Naypyidaw, basically under the NLD administration, but where really the opening is and where really the potential, I think, would be to really restart the peace process and to work on actually what I believe both sides, the Tamadour side and the NUG side, have been, at least publicly, been committing to working on basically this process of a political process of the federalization and of really bringing together a different kind of structure in place for the state and the living together of the different ethnic communities. I think that is a very important point. And so to say, I believe it is now in the interest of all the parties to actually pursue this kind of process. So it is a lost opportunity if we don't look at the peace process and in the ways in which, at least on that front, if not intra-Burman, we can facilitate dialogue, etc. That so to say, I think from a business perspective, as you asked as well, I mean the main requirement for business is stability, and anything that the European Union or other actors can contribute here for a cessation of violence on either side, on an ethnic side, from the side of the Tamadour and from the side of the People's Defense Forces, anything that can be done to bring people to this ideally, formally tripartite negotiation table would be most desirable and would be probably most constructive from my point of view. Really, a peaceful settlement by peaceful means is, I think, the only way in which I'm seeing anything moving forward and any progress to be made.
Thank you very much for all those conclusions from our three distinguished speakers, and I wish to thank very much the three of you for a very, very lively exchange of views, very lively debate, sometimes different point of views or different approaches, which is what a think tank community would like to see and to hear. So I hope everybody has enjoyed and has learned, most importantly, has learned a lot from these discussions. And thank you very much to all the participants, to all of you who have asked questions, to all of you who have been listening carefully. And most of it, thank you very much to our three speakers, to Mo, to Claudine, and to Felix, for very, very interesting inputs to this debate, which, of course, is not the end of the debate on the future of Myanmar. And we will have other opportunities to talk again and to try to find ways forward for the sake of the Myanmar citizens, because as the three of you has mentioned, at the end of the day, most important is the daily livelihood of the citizens on the ground. Thank you very much, and wish a good day to everybody. Thank you, and bye-bye.